Hey historians, this is Mrs. Tyler. Today we are going to do Unit 4, Notes 3 about immigration. You're going to need a highlighter and a pencil as we go through today. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 23 million immigrants arrived in America. They came from all over the world for all kinds of reasons. Many came to escape poverty, political violence, and religious persecutions. Back in 6th grade, when you talked about these things, we call them push factors. They push people to leave their countries. Others came seeking opportunities. We call those pull factors, jobs, opportunities, education, things like that are called pull factors. So those opportunities that their home countries could not provide. Immigration impacted the growth of the United States in incredible ways. Not only did these immigrants become more American as they assimilate, which is another review word from 6th grade social studies, but America also becomes more diverse because we have so many contributions from new members of our population coming from all over the world. Before the 1890s, most immigrants were coming that came from Europe came from Northern and Western Europe. You talked in 6th grade about immigrants coming from England, from Germany here, from Sweden and Norway. That's kind of what we're talking about is what we call the first wave of immigrants before we have a civil war. During the Civil War, we see a huge decrease. It's not real. There's not a whole lot of things pulling people, attracting people to come move to the United States while we were at war with each other. But then a couple years, about a generation after the Civil War is over, we see what we call the second wave of immigration coming. And this time, we're going to see after 1900 more immigrants coming from southern areas, Greece, Italy, Spain, those kinds of areas, Portugal, and then Eastern Europeans, Polish people from Prussia and Eastern Germany, Western Russia, those kinds of areas right here, Yugoslavia, Hungary, those kinds of places. In 1892, the United States opened a new site to process the growing waves and numbers of immigrants coming into the United States from Europe. Ellis Island became the first stop for European immigrants where they were questioned and registered. And you can see this is a photograph of New York. This is over here. This is New Jersey. Over here is New York City. In between, we've got the Statue of Liberty that people passed as they came. Here's Ellis Island that was opened in 1892. And you can see this is the new One World Observatory that stands up in this spot before used to be the Twin Towers, just for reference. So in our notes packet on page 7, we're going to highlight the definition for Ellis Island, and then we're going to label Ellis Island on our map that's at the bottom of the page. Okay, so the immigration station located on the East Coast that served as the main entrance point for millions of immigrants, mainly from Europe. On our map, I want you to write Ellis Island in the space on the East Coast here, and then I want you to identify E is for Europe, where the immigrants were coming from, Ellis for Ellis Island, and East Coast. All of these letter E's are going to help us remember that this side of the country is where we've got European immigrants entering the country at Ellis Island. On page 2 of our notes packet, we have the unit timeline. So would you please add Ellis Island opened in 1892? We have the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, and then 1892 Ellis Island opened. Okay, some immigrants came as refugees from countries facing war. Others came during times of economic depressions when jobs, farmland, and food were scarce. Many came because of the Homestead Act that we talked about in Notes 1 that promised 160 acres of farmland to families willing to settle the frontier. However, most European immigrants settled where the factory jobs were abundant. Cities grew and they faced the challenge of meeting the needs of so many new residents coming in so rapidly. Many immigrants settled in what we call ethnic enclaves or ethnic neighborhoods where with other people who had come from the same country. So make sure you fill in at the bottom of the page. There's a spot near Ellis Island where you're going to write down for European immigrants, millions crossed the Atlantic Ocean, most settled in cities along the East Coast, working in factories and living in crowded tenements that we had talked about in Notes 2. There's the farmers, cities. Between 1881 and 1924, about 2.5 million Jewish immigrants came to the U.S. from Russia and neighboring Eastern European countries. This was to escape religious persecution. In the 1880s, Russians had passed many anti-Jewish laws that discriminated against Jewish people because their religious beliefs require them to worship, dress, and even eat differently. They have dietary laws about what you can and cannot eat together in the same meal. Laws prevented Jews from being allowed to own land or live in big cities. Their children were banned from going to the public schools in Russia. America promised free education and opportunities to live in communities and even own land and businesses here. So it was a big pull factor for Jewish immigrants coming from Eastern Europe, like Russia and such. On the West Coast, we have another group of immigrants coming. First stop for immigrants coming from Asia was Angel Island in the Pacific, on the Pacific coast of California. Angel Island's filthy buildings, most Chinese immigrants were held for several weeks. They faced lengthy interviews and tests to determine if they were fit to stay in the United States. Asian immigrants often had to prove that they were related to current citizens here in the U.S. before they would be released to start their new American lives. They were often nicknamed paper relatives. They would get the name and information of another Chinese person who was already living in the United States, probably not even legitimately related, but they would often memorize that information and say that they were a relative so that they'd be allowed to stay. Nearly 1 in 10 Chinese immigrants was refused entrance and sent back to China. On the map at the bottom of the page, please identify Angel Island and then highlight in our notes the immigration station located on the West Coast that served as the main entrance point for millions of immigrants, mainly from Asia. On that map, would you please identify A is for Asia and Angel Island? So all those things starting with A, it's going to be right here on the coast of California. Because on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, we have the countries of China, Japan, like Thailand, those other Asian countries. This is a photograph of Angel Island. Some of the first Chinese immigrants had come during the gold rush to mine for their fortunes in the 1840s, or 1839, 1840. Many Chinese laborers had been recruited to work for the Central Pacific Railroad in the 1860s. Okay. Chinese immigrants were met with more overt racism. It's easier to tell where you're from if you're from Asia. They look quite a bit different than, and it's not racist to say, it's just an observation that you could tell who was from Asia or who was Chinese versus you couldn't necessarily tell with the European waves of European immigrants coming in. You couldn't necessarily tell which country they were arriving from. So unfortunately, that being able to physically tell a difference in appearance is going to come out with some more overt racism and bigotry towards people coming from Asia. That doesn't mean that people coming from European countries did not face obstacles and discrimination either. Many of them did. There were companies that wouldn't hire people who were Jewish. There were people like in 6th grade you learned about how settlers here in Minnesota were treated differently, especially if they were Finnish. The people coming from Finland were treated differently by the Swedish and the Norwegians here that had settled in Minnesota. So there were discrimination the experiences by people who came no matter where they came from. However, being able to tell just by look where someone was coming from created a different set of issues for those people. One of the things that you might notice if you go visit places like New York City or San Francisco or those places is that there, even still today, are these areas called ethnic enclaves. These are urban neighborhoods where people from the same country or ethnic group settle close together. Examples in New York City, they have Little Italy and Chinatown. They have some in California as well. We have this still happening. It is more comforting and easier to blend in and find your way around when you settle with people who look and speak the same language, who look like you, who have had the similar experiences. Okay, in 1910, Mexico was caught in the middle of a bloody civil war. Mexico's president had allowed wealthy landowners to take over the lands of nearly 15 million farmers and Indians. A rebellion took place when the landless farmers started an uprising, and the violence lasted for a decade. Mexican immigrants found jobs in the United States as farmers in agriculture and then cattle ranching and laborers for the railroad companies. So in the bottom of our notes on page 7, fill in for Mexican immigrants. Many came to escape violence during the Mexican Revolution and found jobs in agriculture, ranching, and the railroad. Okay, during this time, nearly 500,000 Mexicans entered the United States. They came freely with no required passports. Many came on trains. Some even came on foot. Okay, Orchard Street, busy place in New York City. Cities struggled to absorb the rapid population growth that waves of immigrant ships brought them. Many immigrants struggled to find resources like housing and jobs as they arrived. Ethnic enclaves like Little Italy and Chinatown made it easier for new immigrants to get connected with others from their country of origin. The demand for housing meant that immigrant families crowded into rundown tenement buildings. And competition for jobs with American workers meant that immigrants were willing to often work for lower wages in what we call sweatshops and factories. They had low skills. They could easily be replaced. There were millions of immigrants coming in all the time, so there was no shortage of workers, which meant that the factory owners didn't have to do much to treat their workers well. And if you didn't show up to work, you didn't get paid, and you were often replaced really quickly because there's plenty of people who are willing to take a job. So tenements are those urban apartment buildings that barely met minimum safety standards and were often overcrowded with poor immigrant families. And sweatshops are factories with poor or even dangerous working conditions where the workers receive very little pay. Immigrant groups were not always welcome in these new communities. To many U.S. citizens, a seemingly endless wave of newcomers meant more competition for jobs. Immigrants were usually eager to try and assimilate or fit in by adopting American culture, learning to speak English, sending their children to school when it's possible. They don't have to change their religion. Some of them do a little bit, but many of them hang on to some of those cultural elements, but they do want their children to be able to get those educational opportunities. So learning to speak English is a kind of a big deal. Still, the differences in their culture often made them the target of discrimination. Some employers advertised jobs for Christians only. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to limit Asian immigrants. So assimilation, immigrants adopted the cultural elements of their new country or community to blend in. And then, Chinese Exclusion Act, the immigration law passed in 1882 that banned Chinese workers from entering the country. In the 1920s, there's a rise of what we call nativism here in the United States. It's kind of a pro-America, America first. Americans kind of became less welcoming of the streams of immigrants. Also, that's also the era where we are fighting World War I. And so tensions around the world cause us to reconsider who we are letting in and how many we are letting in. And when Europe is completely at war, we don't feel like we can trust everyone who wants to come here. Congress limited immigration through setting quotas or maximum numbers of people will take in each year, and the great wave of immigration to the United States had ended. But by then, America had already become impacted by the diverse cultures brought here by the millions of newcomers. Even while assimilating, immigrants changed America with their foods, their beliefs, languages, music, all these cultural elements. The hardworking men and women with the strong values and new ideas started businesses. They became important to the United States economic landscape and helped build the rest of this country. So positives of immigration, adding diversity. Think of all the foods that we have that come from different parts of the world, and the music and all those cultural elements help grow our economy by providing workers. We talked in notes 2, about inventors coming from as immigrants from like Scotland and those areas. So that's going to definitely help our country as well. Negatives, though, we have overcrowded cities. The cities literally cannot keep up with the massive influx of people coming in every single day. Immigrants were competing with Americans for jobs and accepting lower wages. On the bottom of page 8, make sure that you complete this activity. Make a correction up here where it says 1930s. It's supposed to say 1830s there. And then just use 2 different color pencils to go every other one so that you can kind of see this the influx of immigrants coming in. Make sure that that's done before we take quiz 1, and have a fantastic day.